Hi Year 12, welcome to this second lecture that would in theory be a classroom lesson that I've converted to an online lesson, which I can appreciate can be a bit infuriating seeing as you've already watched a lecture on educational policy in order to watch this one. This is after you have watched the first 15 minutes 30 seconds of my education and state policy lecture. The last one we did on this week was on an in-depth look at the tripartite system as a class lesson, and this one's going to focus on the comprehensive and marketisation system. So I'm just going to go back to this question with you that I start each one with. What does it mean to go from a meritocracy to parentocracy when it comes to school selection? You should be really clear now about the meritocratic way. In the meritocratic way, the tripartite system was selective based on 11+. You've had a go at the 11+. So you should be able to explain how from 1944 to 1965, it was a meritocratic selection system. Whereas now we're in a system known as parentocracy, where it's very much about the parents' choice and the ability of parents to make good choices about what school to send their young children to. Or older children, of course. So, just to kind of get started, I would have asked you to remember the different grammar arguments in favour and against grammar schools based on that question time episode you hopefully have watched from me already. So just see if you can quickly get your ideas down without looking at your notes. What were the arguments in favour and what were the arguments against? It's much easier to think of the arguments against. In terms of arguments in favour, one I'll give you is they were seen as a way of bright working class students of getting a very good standard of education, getting an academic education. Because in theory, that working class student sat the 11+, did well because they were naturally gifted, and they would have gone on and had quite an academic education, which would have translated into hopefully a middle class job. So, grammar schools were seen as a way of, liberalising the working classes. However, linked to an argument against that hopefully you'll all make a note of, we know that grammar schools are notoriously bad at taking free school meal students or pupil premium students, which are, if you like, the measures of perhaps students from working class backgrounds. So yeah, see what you can remember in favour and against grammar schools and the problems, particularly that issue with 11+ being taken at that age. You all had a go at it, it's not a pleasant experience even when you're a bit older, let alone at that age of 11. So 1965, it's a Labour government at this point, and they introduced comprehensive schools, and they want schools to be more equal. They want to kind of break this cycle of the well-off middle-class students passing 11+, getting into the grammar schools, and if you like, kind of carrying on that cycle of class inequality where they will end up with the middle-class jobs, whereas the working-class kids going to the secondary moderns, being taught a much more practical education, preparing them for working class jobs. So the Labour government wanted to get rid of this recreation of class inequality cycle. So they introduced comprehensive schools. And they wanted a much more egalitarian system of education, an equal system, where these schools would take all types of pupils, regardless of class, ethnicity, ability, to avoid the class divide of the tripartite system that I've just gone through. And the big way of selection, the key term to do with comprehensive schools is catchment areas. So they took pupils from their catchment area. So all local kids went to their local school. Sounds like a fantastic idea. However, there were significant problems, and I've given you a map of a catchment area in London, in East London. I'd like you to have a look at that as an example of a catchment area and kind of use that to explain why didn't comprehensive schools create more equality in educational outcomes, and what were the problems with catchment areas. I actually used to work in this catchment area. I can highlight a few. You can't really tell from I guess a bird's eye view, but that's a lot of social housing on the left-hand side, north and south. That's a lot of social housing. It's really built up. There is, to the far right, there's quite an industrial area. There is a sewage treatment works, There is a really busy road, the A13, that runs through it. And to the south, you have the city of airport, London City Airport, which, great for your really expensive holidays, unless you can't afford them. So, depending on what way the wind was going, some days you get sort of like smells of sewage, and others you get airplane fuel. So I'd like you to write a brief note on, what were the problems with catchment areas? Why did that method of selection, why did that actually not create equality of educational outcomes? The other thing that's worth remembering when it comes to comprehensive schools is that they had to manage a wide range of abilities. So what did they start to do in order to cope with a wide range of abilities in schools? Also in response to the pressures from middle class parents who were very worried about the idea of their precious young children or being educated with the ruffians from down the road. So what did they introduce to manage such a wide range of abilities, which again is linked back to that idea that actually they didn't really produce the equality of educational outcomes that they desired. So for this activity, I'm going to ask you to write out each of these statements, I guess, into 2 columns, but remember one of these is actually from the New Right. This is using theory to evaluate the comprehensive system. So I'd like you to work out which of these reflect the functionalist view of comprehensive education and which of them reflect the Marxist view of comprehensive education. And like I said, one of them is the New Right view. So you do need to write these different statements out and tell me which theory you think they are. The bits in red are just saying that these are critical points, okay? The stuff in black is actually arguments kind of in favour of comprehensive education. So I'm not going to read through them all, but I'd like you to pause the lecture at this point and get these down. So just to kind of summarise, why didn't the introduction of comprehensives create the desired class equality that Labour believed it would? You have already answered this question for me, but if you could pause and have a think and see if you can get down some ideas, that'd be great. And I'll just take you through the main points, so hopefully you thought of these. First one was, as I said before, catchment areas. School populations basically reflected the house prices local to the school. So if you had a school in a very well-off, salubrious area where house prices were relatively high, you're going to get students from a middle-class background. And the plus of that is that therefore means they come with, a set of middle-class parents with middle-class capital, both economic and cultural, that we know benefits their educational performance. They introduced setting and streaming, and this was to, in the first place really to placate middle-class parents, but mainly to cope with those wide range of abilities. And what that meant was that, young people were not getting the same standard of education. They weren't getting the same resources. They weren't getting the same teachers. Okay, they were getting different experience. They were getting a very different experience of education depending on what set they were in. And finally, linking back to that grammar school debate, a number of the local authorities opted out of the comprehensivization, and they kept the 11+ system in grammar schools for quite some time, up until the 1970s. And even today, we have just over, I think it's 164 grammar schools in the UK today. So they're still around, and they're still, if you like, harming the journey towards class equality through educational opportunity. So I also talked to you a little bit about vocational education in the lecture. What actually is vocational education? So you should know this from the lecture, so I'm going to ask you to make a note of that now. What actually is vocational education? That does come up quite often in the exam, so make sure you've got a really nice, clear definition of vocational education. Examples of vocational education include things like health and social care, construction, woodwork, metalwork, secretarial courses. Oh gosh, I can't remember anymore now. The BTEC courses that are currently around is probably the most modern incarnation of vocational education. So they've been around for quite some time. But what I'd like you to do is apply theory to vocational education. So what do you think the new right think of vocational education courses? Bearing in mind, it was introduced by a Conservative Party, which has a new right agenda. So I'll give you a clue. They're generally pretty big fans of vocational education. However, what would Marxists think about it? And that links to kind of my last bullet point there. What do you think Marxists think of vocational courses? What do you think they actually end up preparing certain students for? Because what sorts of students, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, what sorts of students kept on ending up on those vocational courses? Give you a clue, it wasn't the middle classes. And what would feminists think of it? So whereas Marxists were really critical of it from a class perspective, feminists were very critical of it from a gender perspective. So I'll give you a clue. They reinforced patriarchy, but tell me how. How did they reinforce patriarchy? And then finally, there's that question that you've answered for me again. Why did vocational courses recreate class inequality? And ultimately, the real point you want to make with that one is that they were preparing young people for low-paid jobs. And if those young people on those courses were working class, you're preparing them for low-paid work. So it's going to recreate class inequality. Oh, there's some examples of vocational courses. Childcare. And over there we've got, looks like engineering or mechanical car work engineering. So the final policy in the lecture that you looked at for me is the policy of parental choice that we have examined before when we looked at the new right view of education. And that's because it was introduced in 1988 by a new right government under Thatcher. That's just an example of a league table there. I haven't got the specific percentages to show you. But if you were a parent, which of those schools would you want to send your kid to? Okay, and which of those schools would you not want to send your kids to? I think it's pretty obvious. Most parents would want to send their kids to the top of the list. And that's one of the problems with parental choice. In the lecture you've listened to before, it's useful to think of it almost as a game of musical chairs, in the sense that there's a chair for everyone, okay, but some chairs are far more attractive than others. And when those attractive chairs are taken, that means everyone's left kind of for the more rubbish chairs. So I'm just going to apply that back into education, which might be more useful if you have to talk about it in an essay. So there are enough school places for all children in all areas, okay, in the UK. The problem is that some school places are better than others. So looking at that league table, it's the schools towards the top of that league table. They look and they seem much better than others. They're more likely to get a better quality educational outcome if you're going to send your child there. And parents, to get to the top school particularly, they've got to go through great lengths. Okay, they have to go through a complex application process. They've got to be really aware of what the league tables and the Ofsted reports say. They might even have to move house. Okay, so they're a bit closer to the best schools. Okay, even though catchment isn't the most important factor, it does still play a role. They really have to work hard to get their child into one of those top schools. They might even pay for private tutors for their kids' primary education, so they give them extra sort of quite good SAT results so that their child looks really attractive to those schools. They might pay for a private tutor at that point to get them into a really good school, okay? And that all is to do with economic capital. And in a real marketplace, if this really was a world of business and profit, you'd make more of the product that everyone wanted. So you would make, I don't know, more of the best type of phone because everyone wanted that particular phone. But the best schools, they can't take unlimited students. You know, if that school at the top just took all the students, it probably wouldn't be the best school in the area anymore, okay? because they'd have a broader range of kids, they'd have bigger class sizes, it would really change the nature of the school. So it's not a genuine marketplace in that sense. So here are some questions that I want you to answer. Where does all the money go? Okay, in parental choice, which schools end up with all of the money? Well, not all of it, but most of the money. And really, where should the money go? At least more of it. Where do you think some of the money should be directed? Because, you know, one of the things about parental choice is that the more students you get in, the more money each student represents. That's all part of the funding formula. But if you're a school towards the bottom of that table, you're not going to be getting lots and lots of kids in through the door. So every year you're going to get less and less funding. So you can't afford to, repair the school, buy new resources, hire new staff, okay? Which ultimately is going to mean your results go down and down and down. It's like a vicious circle. And I'd like you to answer that last question. I think it's pretty obvious. What type of students end up in those poorly performing schools? And ultimately, as a result, why does that end up recreating that class inequality cycle we've been looking at already? So if you could answer those questions in your notes, that'd be great. Now, I would like you to do this as a recall activity. I don't want you to look back at your notes until, I guess, you've had a go at it. What did Gerwitz, Ball and Bow, or Gerwitz et al., what did they find out about why middle class parents were so much better than working class parents at parental choice? We've already looked at this study, okay? So you do already have notes on it. But like I said, I'd like you to have a go at recalling as much as you can before checking your notes to fill in this table. So remember, they found there were 3 types of parents, or they categorised the parents that they interviewed into 3 different categories. They said there was the privileged skilled choosers, the disconnected local choosers, and the semi-skilled choosers. Now, what I'd like you to write is how each of those different types of parents, how they managed the parental choice process. Like, what were they good at? What were their strengths? And what barriers did they have to overcome? I'll give you a quick clue. The top group, privileged skilled choosers, they had all the strengths. The other ones, they had a few more barriers, okay? And semi-skilled choosers, it's a little bit of the both. I'm not going to give you the answers for this because you've already got it, okay? So pause and have a go at that activity. Final activity then for today's lesson, and this is in sort of speech marks, fun activity. I'd like you to listen to a song. You probably have already heard of it. It's called Another Brick in the Wall by Pink Floyd. I'll share the link with you, but you can also just Google search the song and find it on YouTube. And I'd like you to figure out which of the above policies does this song criticise, and explain your answer. Is it the tripartite system, the comprehensive system, vocational education, or marketisation? And if you can listen to the song, but if you can watch the video as well, I think that kind of helps as well. So which of the above policies does that song criticise? Thanks for listening, guys. Hopefully I'll get to see you shortly to run through some of the any misunderstandings or you're not too sure about in terms of this topic. The next lecture for you guys to watch will be the middle section of that big lecture, which will be on new Labour's policies. So look out for that one. Thanks.